Okay, welcome everybody to our October webinar, Difficult Workplace Conversations. My name is Carli Saw. I'm the Director of Strawberry Seed Consulting. And this evening, I'm going to take you through hopefully some practical tips and ideas and strategies to help you work your way through conversations that you may find difficult with your employees. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we're attending from today and pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging. And I extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who are attending our webinar today. So who is Strawberry Seed Consulting? If you're not familiar, we are a boutique HR consulting firm. We work with clients all around the country from such a wide range of industries, from professional services to allied health, retail, building and construction, you name it, we probably have worked with it. We worked with a chicken or poultry farm recently, so that was quite interesting. This is my gorgeous team. We've recently had a couple of our team members, one not returned from maternity leave and one who has moved on to a new opportunity. But the great thing has been that we haven't had to put anyone else on because a number of the team have taken on more hours. So, but for now, this is the team, but that doesn't mean we're not going to be growing in the new year. Before I get going, I do want to let you know that if you have any questions as we go along, please throw them in the Q&A. And at the end, I'm going to hopefully have a bit of time left where I'll answer any questions that I can. So let's get started. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about workplace culture because I think it's important to realise how much of an impact the way we approach conversations in our workplace has implications on the culture for everybody. I do love this quote that culture is how employees' hearts and stomachs feel about Monday morning on a Sunday night. Because for me, it's difficult to define culture. There's a lot of information out there. There are a lot of definitions, but ultimately it's how your employees feel in your workplace. So if you think about it as the character and the personality of your business, every interaction, every behaviour, every conversation you have, the traditions and values that you show are going to drive that workplace culture. And really, as a people manager, you need to consider yourself as an influencer in that culture. You're the person who's steering the ship. And you can influence culture by a lot of things, the decisions you make, how you handle certain situations, what you choose to say, how you say it, and just generally by leading by example on how you approach situations. So we're going to talk about conversations today, and really it's important to remember that conversations are a two-way street. They're not an interrogation. They're not sitting there and telling people things and expecting them to just take that information on. A conversation should be exchanged between two people of thoughts and ideas and information and how they're feeling. It is a mix of verbal and non-verbal communication, and it should involve a back and forth, people listening to each other and responding. Obviously, conversations can occur in a number of different formats, from face-to-face through to online chats and emails and things like that. And personally, I think that if any conversation is going to be had that you are worried about or you're considered might be a difficult conversation for you, then you really need to choose face-to-face as an option, even if it's via video, because there's so much nuance that can be lost in written communication. And really, you want a conversation to be effective. So that means active listening, mutual respect and open communication. And that's a lot easier to achieve when you are face-to-face, even when it's uncomfortable. So it might seem strange that, I want everyone to think about the fact that how a conversation goes really does come down to the mindset that you go into that conversation with. Because whether or not a conversation is going to be difficult often comes from our own anxiety, from nerves that we might have in regards to approaching that conversation. Now, that could be because we've had a difficult conversation with someone in the past, or that particular employee has been difficult to deal with in the past. And so therefore that causes some anxiety about that interaction. It could just be because our personality is non-confrontational. We don't like to rock the boat. We don't like conflict. So therefore we shy away from it. It can just be because we're just not sure what to say, or we're afraid of saying the wrong thing. So I think the mindset you take into a conversation, whatever that conversation might be, is one of the most important factors, because it's going to help shape the direction that that conversation is going to take. If you can move into a conversation with an employee, particularly one you think will be difficult, with the mindset of, I'm here to understand, I'm here, I have some concerns that I want to address or an issue I'd like to address, but I'm here to have a conversation, learn more from this employee and work out if there is any action that needs to be taken, as opposed to, I'm here to put accusations to this person, then it's a very different feel to the conversation. So I think if you can change that approach that you're having, it can really, from the second that you decide you need to have that conversation, it can really make a big difference in the outcomes. And it's really interesting when you talk about difficult conversations, because I mean, I've been in HR for 27 years, and you know what one person sees as a difficult conversation, someone else sees as an easy one. You know, it's going to depend on you as an individual to what are the conversations that you might find harder than others. Some people find it really easy to give positive feedback, but difficult to give negative feedback. Others vice versa. I've worked with a few tradies as clients who don't seem to have any problem whatsoever being very direct and specific in their feedback, but they have a lot more issues responding to an employee coming to them with a concern or telling them they have a mental health issue, because they play with their strengths. And I think, you know, from providing direction and instruction through to disciplinary action, what is considered a difficult conversation is going to be based on you as an individual and what your concerns are. But I think universally, what I would really like you to think about is that there are things going into a conversation that you can control and things that you can't control. And so often I think our anxiety or our stress about having a conversation stems from the fact that we worry about the things we have no control over, and they're the things we need to let go of. So they're things like what others are going to do or say, whether their employee is going to accept feedback, whether the meeting is going to go to plan, whether other people are going to react well or badly, what decisions they've made, how they're going to behave, what's happened in the past or in the future, what other people are thinking or feeling or what they believe, and whether or not the employee is going to accept responsibility. All of these things are outside of your control. They're in the employee's control, not yours. And that, I think, applies to any difficult conversation. I mean, this is something that you can use with employees that have to work together and have disagreements. You know, really, we need to concentrate on what is in that purple circle. What are the things that I can control? I can control the responsibility that I take for my own actions and what I'm doing and saying, the questions I ask, the words I choose, how I respond in that moment. I can control the preparation I do, how I treat others, and how I live up to the values and expectations of the organisation myself. But I can try and influence others, but I cannot control it. So I think most of our anxiety does come from those things outside of our control. And part of setting your mindset before coming into a conversation is really working out, what are the things that you're concerned about going into the conversation? What are the reasons you're apprehensive about it? What are the reasons you're putting it off? And really try to pinpoint those and concentrate on the things that you can control, not the things that you can't. I'm going to try and bear with me for a second, because I'm trying to, there we go, hide the meeting controls, because I'm having technical difficulties. Okay, so before we get into the nitty gritty of having those conversations, I want to talk about setting some foundations, because anyone that's worked with Strawberry Seed in the past will have heard us talk about setting clear expectations and boundaries, which will allow you to hold people accountable. And having some really good foundations makes some of those conversations a lot easier to have, because you're coming from a place of a shared understanding. So I think you need to remember that if you are not clear on the expectations yourself, on what the expected levels of performance are or acceptable behaviour, how are your employees going to be? So you need to ensure, like sometimes when someone rings us and say, I'm having this problem with an employee, the first thing we ask is, are they clear on their, a number of things within their role? Do they know why their job exists? Do they know why it fits into the organisation, how it fits, how their responsibilities link to what the organisation's trying to achieve, but also how their job actually links in with other employees' jobs, because sometimes conflicts and things can happen because two people are trying to do the same thing because they're not clear on whose role it is. They need to be clear on the boundaries in which they operate. And by boundaries, I mean, there needs to be some structure, because often we make a lot of assumptions that people have the same understanding as us. So a good example of that is flexible work. When someone says my team work flexibly, what does that actually mean? Is it they pick and choose their own hours and I have no expectations on how they're going to do that? Or do they have to do it within certain boundaries and parameters? Am I happy for them to switch shifts that are like for like, but I expect them to seek out some approval before they take on an additional shift? What hours do I actually need them to be available? Can they work all night and sleep all day if they want to? Or do I actually have an expectation that they will be available during working hours? Boundaries are something that are often unsaid, and they don't become an issue until an employee does something you were not expecting, or that someone else hasn't done, or they've interpreted something differently. And we need to remember, every single individual that works for us is a different person, and they look at the world through a different lens. So they may have a different experience of how boundaries work in previous workplaces. And that also goes to what is acceptable workplace behaviour as well. And clarifying those expectations and boundaries is actually the first step, because you've got to remember that when you hire someone, unless they've worked from you, you're their first job and from the first time they've ever worked, then you are inheriting expectations and boundaries of their previous managers. So things that were normal, things that were acceptable or not acceptable in their past jobs are something that you're inheriting. So if you're inheriting someone who has been micromanaged, who has had a manager that treated them terribly, that they're coming into you with that trauma already. So you can't, if someone's not responding or reacting or doing something the way you think, it's really good to explore why first, because you may find it's something that you weren't even aware of. A really simple example, I had an employee, one of my team, who started working for me, and very early on she rang me and said, I'm going to, what format do you want me to send you this document in? And I kind of said, I don't care, doesn't bother me. Turns out she had a previous manager who everything had to be in PDF format when they sent it in. So that was what she was used to. Whereas me, my expectation was completely different. Another instance, I had an employer ring me and say, I've got this employee and they keep coming to me every 5 minutes to give me an update on what they're doing. I have no idea what's going on. What's wrong with them? And I said, did you ask them why? Turns out their previous manager was a micromanager and wanted constant updates. So sometimes you need to clarify those expectations, and they're the things that help build trust between you and that employee. Some people will trust you from day one. They will walk in and they will trust you and they will believe what you say. But if somebody has come from a previous workplace where there wasn't a lot of trust, they weren't managed well, then you may find that it takes time and consistency to build that trust over time. So as we start to get into the nitty-gritty of feedback, I'd like you to think about the idea of feedback with empathy. And I wanted to start with this quote from Adam Grant. Blaming and shaming doesn't stop people from making mistakes. It stops them from admitting mistakes. If people can't share their blunders, they can't learn from them, and neither can the rest of us. The best way to prevent errors is to make it safe for people to discuss them. We are human beings managing other human beings. And I think we need to remember that sometimes. As human beings, people managers have good days and bad days. We have days where we're tired or we're anxious or we're really under the pump and busy and we're short with people. We are human beings and we don't always react in the way we would like to think we would react. And the same applies to our employees. So I think when it comes to thinking about going into these conversations, if you can come from a place of empathy, it can really help you to understand and get to the root cause of things a lot quicker than when you come in without it. You know, empathy is a range of things. It's all the emotions and experiences, and it can be very difficult to define. If you think about it as the ability to sense what other people's emotions and feelings are and imagine ourselves in their place and what they might be thinking or feeling. Now, that's not always possible. We haven't always had the same point of reference or context. I am the parent of a neurodiverse son who finds it incredible, who's incredibly empathetic, but finds it difficult to actually gauge himself what other people's emotions are at certain times and to interpret that. So, you know, not everybody is going to have the same ability to gauge where someone is at. So sometimes we have to have conversations to help us work out what that is. And there may be reasons that you might need to adjust your expectations for someone during particular moments of their life. Human beings come to work, they don't do it in a bubble. We don't come to work and just nothing outside work affects us. That's just unrealistic. Doesn't happen to us as people managers, and it certainly doesn't happen to our employees. There may be a range of reasons and times in people's life where you just need to be a little bit more empathetic and understanding to their situation. There could be a time of bereavement, illness or injury. I had ankle surgery on Saturday, so I'm having to adjust my expectations of myself this week on what I can achieve and not achieve. Major life changes or events, divorce, moving house, things happen in people's lives. And, you know, I love the idea that, you know, as long as people are giving me 100% of what they've got available that day, that's all I can ask for. And doing your best looks different every day. Sometimes you have to manage your energy levels when you're managing other things outside of the workplace. Certainly I've needed to be really conscious this week. I'm sitting here with my foot up underneath the desk, and I'm not allowed to drive at the moment. I am off crutches, but I'm on some pretty strong pain medication. So I've had to even today manage when I take that and how much energy I made sure I had tonight to be able to deliver this webinar. So being able to be empathetic and understanding to what that might look like for different people in your organisation, I think is really important. And sometimes you might not know. And I think you shouldn't be afraid to have conversations with employees. At Strawberry Seed, in the last couple of years, we've had several people lose parents. We've had serious illness. We've had people moving house, moving interstate. We've had divorce. You know, we've had a lot of big life events, babies born, miscarriage. All of these things can happen within a workplace. And we're not a big team. And let's not even think about what COVID added into the mix. But some of the things that might be helpful in terms of what to say to people in these situations to gauge what it is that they need and where they're at. I particularly love how are you today? And it's the today that's really important for me. I'm a parent of a neurodiverse child that's had a lot of physical and mental health issues in the last couple of years. And, you know, our life can get pretty hairy sometimes. And how are you just doesn't cut it. But how are you going today? How are you feeling today? Is really has more meat to it, because it means that you show that you understand that every day may be different. Today might be a good day or today might be a terrible day. It doesn't mean every day is. So that's one that I like to start with. What can I do to make your life easier right now? It's such a simple question. Some people might want to work through difficult times. Some might not. Some might not even know it's not an option, that they can't, or they don't have to work through that time. So ask them, what do you actually need right now? Now, they may not know the answer to that, and that's okay. But it could be as simple as saying, look, I've got a couple of ideas I'd like to run past you so we can work through together, so we can work something out that works for everyone. Now, some people, when they're working through a difficult time or they've got something happening, you know, a parent that's you know, towards the end of their life, they might want to be at work. Work might be something that they need. So give them that option. Say, do you need time off? Or would you prefer to be here? And kind of go with them. But you might make adjustments. You might say, look, let's maybe, yep, I'm happy for you to be here, but maybe let's take away some customer facing stuff for the next week, just so that you've got the flexibility that if you feel like you can't be here, you can just step away. So there are things that you can do and suggest to them that might be really helpful, and be flexible. We had a client that had one of their employees had their baby quite prematurely. And she wanted to come back to work. Like, she was convinced, I want to work. I don't want to just be worrying and sitting around waiting. And, I said to them, just go with the flow. If you've got some stuff she can do, great. If not, don't force her hand, and really just let her. I think within a couple of days she was ready to. She realised it wasn't really viable for her to be working, but they let her work through that herself. And I believe that all of these things, being able to show empathy for people in different times of their life, can really make a huge difference to not just their experience of working for you, but their ability to be loyal to you, and also want to be helpful to you too when the shoe's on the other foot. Which moves us on to delivering feedback. Feedback is a gift. Anyone that's been to some of our stuff's probably seen this slide before, but the employee might not always feel like it's a gift in that moment, and that's okay. Human beings don't like hearing things that don't make them feel good about themselves. Where human beings have egos, that's part of our makeup. But good feedback delivered well and in the right way can generate questions and discussions and insights, and actually really build strong relationships. We want to be aiming for engaged feedback. So you're ready to give engaged feedback as a people manager when you're ready to sit next to someone rather than across from them. That is that's not literal. It may be that the setup of where you're actually meeting, you are sitting across from you, but it's the idea that they don't feel like they're sitting across from you about to be interrogated, that they feel like you're sitting beside them and working along with them. You're willing to put the problem in front of you rather than between you. That you're ready to listen and ask questions and accept that you might not fully understand the issue. So many conversations you will go into, if you go into it thinking you know everything, is not a great start. If you go into it going, I think I know what needs to be addressed, I think I understand the issues, but I want to go in and make sure I have all the information. So you're going in to understand and to learn, not just to go in and provide feedback, is a really great approach, because then you may find things out that you didn't know. And you need to be open to the fact that you may not have all the information. When you're ready to acknowledge that what someone does well as talking about the things that are not so well. It's good to say, look, some people, it's very rare that someone's all good or all bad. They might do many aspects of their job well, but there are things you need to address. And it's perfectly fine to say, I've been really happy with the way you've been dealing with clients lately. Like, I can't fault that. However, I need to address the fact that you haven't been getting your notes in, or you haven't been getting your reports in on time, whatever it might be. And you can recognize their strengths and how we can use them to address the challenges. How can you recognize what they're doing well and maybe help them see how they can use that to improve in the areas they need to? You're ready to give engaged feedback when you're open to owning your own part. You may have a part in the issue at hand. Maybe your instructions or directions weren't clear to the employee. Maybe you weren't clear on your expectations or what you wanted, or you were quite vague, or you just didn't even give deadlines and things like that. You may not have been perfect in what you provided. So you need to be willing to take that on and open to that as well, if you expect the employee to be. When you can genuinely thank someone for their effort rather than just criticize their failings. Sometimes someone is actually doing their best, and you can see that they're genuinely trying, but they're not quite getting there. So you need to acknowledge, I can see how hard you've worked. I can see that you've really, put a lot of effort in here. but we're still falling short in these areas. How can we help you to build to bridge that gap? You know, is it a skill issue? Look, it may be they're not the right fit for the role. That might be the outcome, but you know, really genuinely acknowledging that someone's made an effort. When you can talk about how resolving these challenges will lead to growth and opportunity, there is an opportunity by taking on board this feedback, there's an opportunity for you to continue to grow and be better in your role. And a lot of that comes from trust. A lot of that does come from the ability of employees to trust that you're coming from a good place in what you're providing to them. You're not just being critical, but you're there to help them. And that is part of that mindset. And to model vulnerability and openness that you would like to see from your employee, being open to the fact that you might be uncomfortable in the conversation, being open to the fact that you might not have said things perfectly, but you're genuinely just coming from a good place, can really put the employee at ease and make them more receptive to what you're saying. Now, I love this quote by Monty Williams, who is an NBA coach. I'm not calling you out, I'm calling you up. Now, I got a lot of street credibility from my 19-year-old when I told him I was quoting Monty Williams in my training. I didn't tell him I had to actually Google who Monty Williams was. But I really love this approach to holding people accountable, because it's thinking about accountability from the perspective of calling someone up, not calling them out. So you're holding them accountable because you know they're capable of more. You're asking them to rise to their potential. So you're not coming in just to point out their flaws and tell them to fix them. You're coming in and saying, you know what, I believe in you. I know you can do better. I know you've shown me in the past, or I believe you have the potential. So I am here to try and help you reach your best. It's a completely different mindset and approach to coming in and you're still holding someone accountable, but you're holding them accountable and with a likelihood of a different outcome than if you just come in and going, we set these expectations, you're not meeting them, why not? So when it comes to delivering feedback, some of the general guidelines, you need to be clear on what you want to say before you say it. Now, I'm not talking about scripting a conversation. I'm not talking about having every single word written out, ready to go. But you need to be clear on the points that you need to make, the issues you want to address, and the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve. Having said that, you need to be open to the fact that you don't have all the information, and maybe this conversation is going to open your eyes to a lot of things. So you need to be open-minded. You need to share your feedback in a concise and specific manner before you embellish. Sometimes when we're nervous, we can have a tendency to use a lot of words and really almost hide the bit that we're scared about saying, that we're worried about someone's response to. You need to be clear and concise and specific, and then you can go into more detail. Today I need to speak to you about the way you were responding to people in the last meeting. You need to be clear about what you're talking about. You want to avoid generalizations, and by that I mean things like you always and you never. It's very rare that people always do something or never do something, though my teenagers seem to say that a lot. But that's rare. And when you start using generalizations, you lose people because they're like, well, that's not true. Whereas if you can say, in the last 2 meetings, I have noticed that you have spoken over other people when they were trying to get their point across. That's not always. It's in the last 2 meetings. It's specific. It's factual. We want to address the behaviour and not the person. They're not a bad person. What they've done, it may be what they've done is unacceptable. So it's not a personal attack. It's feedback on what they have done and what they need to fix. You definitely need to own the feedback. If you're the person delivering it, you need to own it. Coming in and saying, Betty said you did this, loses a lot of credibility. Now, Betty may be the one that passed it on to you, but you're the one delivering it. So you come in and say, I need to talk to you about this issue that has come to my attention, because that's my job to do so. But you don't sort of blame others to try and deflect off yourself. And don't just jump straight into advice. People have some great ideas on things. And look, there's a very small percentage of people who do not have self-awareness. I did an unfair dismissal with a client this week, and that employee had very little self-awareness. but it's not everybody. The majority do. So coming in and starting to just give people advice rather than saying, okay, we've gotten to this situation. What do you think we could have done differently? What do you think we could do better next time? You may find they're very aware and they have a lot of those ideas themselves. And it's always going to have more impact when it's them collaborative working with you for a result rather than you just coming in and you know, running out, this is what they have to do. So when it comes to starting conversations, don't go into a lot of small talk. You know, oh, how are you? How are things? How are your weekend? You know, if you're in a meeting that, you know, has a purpose to it, simply starting with thank you for making the time to meet with me or to talk with me today is fine. It's when you're going to have a conversation that's about a tricky subject or something difficult, it's not the time to be making small talk with people. I need your help with can be a really useful introduction. I need your help with understanding what happened when I wasn't here on Friday. I need your help knowing what to do about the way people have been working in this particular team. And it's about communicating that you're not opponents in that conversation. You're actually teammates, and you're there to work with them and you're asking for their help to come up with a solution. You're not accusing them of anything, and that can really, again, set that tone for the meeting. Now, a really good strategy you can use to actually identifying and getting to a core of an issue, to be able to put it quite succinctly, is core situation impact, CSI. Now, CSI has a lot of, crime scene investigation things, but it is a good acronym to remember. And that's about looking at what is the root cause or core of the issue you're trying to address, offering an example to demonstrate the situation, and making sure that the person you're giving that feedback to understands the impact of what that is having. So I'll start with a really basic example. And as I go through, a lot of the examples I use will be quite generic, and that is because human beings are nuanced. The situations are nuanced. It can be very difficult to give too many really specific examples, but I try to choose things that I think are fairly universal and most of us can understand. So let's just say you want to speak to an employee because during your last team meeting, they seemed quite disinterested. I want you to do well at work, and our team meetings really make a difference to how we operate as a team. So that's the core. I noticed you were sending emails on your phone during the last meeting. That's a situation you're addressing. And that made me feel like you weren't engaged with what I was saying. That was the impact of what they were doing. Now, there's other ways that you can, and phrases that you might use when you're coming into those things like, I am concerned about, I have noticed that. At our last meeting, we agreed that you needed to do X to meet performance standards. The facts are that you haven't shown those things we discussed. Your behaviour hasn't been up to an acceptable standard because you have continued to talk over people in meetings. The last sales statistics show that you have not made any improvement in your sales figures. So it's more, and this comes back to thinking about how you're going to frame something. You don't want to be accusatory. You want to frame it in a way that people are not going to go immediately on the defensive. The next thing, once you've sort of worked out what the issues are, is when to address the issue. Now, we want to look for that Goldilocks moment. You know, too early and you might not be ready. I mentioned earlier that we're all human beings. People managers are human beings, and sometimes you're not in the right frame of mind. You are really busy. You're in pain because you had your ankle operated on. You are tired. You have just been told that someone has really stuffed up, and you're fuming because all you can think about is the implications. That is not the moment you should have the conversation with the employee, because you are not at your best, and you should allow yourself to be human, recognize that you may not be up to your best in that moment. And it's perfectly fine to say something along the lines of, I need to take a moment to digest what's happened and look into it a bit further. Can we catch up tomorrow to sort of chat about what's happened so I can get more information. But I need to kind of digest this a bit before I make any decisions or look into it further. Acknowledge that it is perfectly okay to do that. And because you don't want to be overly emotional, you don't want to be unnecessarily harsh, you don't want to be reactive yourself. And as much as you'd like to control your own reactions, you need to recognize when you're not going to be able to. You also don't want to leave it too late. We talk a lot about having awkward conversations early rather than a hard conversation later. And often something will come up and we'll go, oh, it's not quite the right time. Or now it's not quite the right time. Or now, and suddenly you've avoided it. And you're like, oh, it's too late now. I can't address it. I'll just let it go. You want your Goldilocks moment. You want the time when the feedback is going to be just right. So I would say that's within a week. It's still within the most recent mindset. When you're ready to approach it calmly, you can offer it as a recent example and still maintain that momentum. The employee, it's fresh in their minds what happened as well. When to address an issue it also includes when and where, I think. You need to choose a time where there's plenty of time to do it. Saying to an employee 10 minutes before you've got to run into another meeting or 10 minutes before the end of their shift, hey, can you come in? I want to address this issue with you. That potentially might be a half an hour conversation, not ideal. Better to say, it's your job to carve out the time to do it. If you are managing people and you need to deal with a people issue, guess what? You need to make the time to make that happen because it's part of your job. So it's better to say, maybe pull that person and say, hey, listen, can we catch up? Can I grab half an hour with you first thing in the morning? I want to discuss a couple of things with you. Allow the time, allow the space. Know that these conversations often take longer than what you expect. So if you think it's going to be a half an hour meeting, maybe allow an hour so you don't have to run off to someone else or something else, and you have the ability to have that conversation. It's not, and it would be very rare that you should ask someone to come in outside of their shift. So if something's happened, there's 5 minutes left of the shift, that is not the time to address it. The next time to address it is when they're next back in the workplace. You can't expect an employee to stay back or you'll be paying them overtime. So, and again, that little things like that can just put things off on the wrong foot. Someone's already annoyed because they had to go pick up their kids or something and now you're making them late or they had other plans or, so it should be addressed during work hours, and pick the appropriate location. Some businesses have small workplaces. When I worked for a big company, we had this meeting room that was at the top of the stairs and it was surrounded in glass. We called it the fishbowl. It was the absolute worst place to do a meeting. There was another tucked away down the bottom on the bottom floor in the back corner with no windows room. That's often where I would have, and you barely walk past anybody to get there. So when I was going to have a meeting with someone that wasn't going to be in my office, I often use that meeting room because they wouldn't have to walk past everyone and have them wonder what they were doing and where they were going, because humans are, nosy creatures. You don't want people to feel exposed. You want to give them privacy, particularly if they may not have a great reaction. And sometimes that may be outside the workplace. It may be appropriate to say, let's go for a walk. Can we go grab a coffee and sit down? I want to have a chat with you and I want to do it somewhere private. So do keep that in mind. When to have the conversation. Again, there may be times when you have avoided having the conversation. You should have had it. The time has passed. You've let it go. But we talked about vulnerability, and I think that's where vulnerability can really come into its own. So you might say something like, I've noticed this for a while, but I haven't known how to address it, and I didn't know how to bring it up. But if I keep sitting on this, I think it's going to be detrimental to our relationship. So you're acknowledging to them that you should have brought this up sooner, and it's on you that you didn't, but you've realized that you need to do it. That vulnerability will make that person more receptive to what you have to say and less annoyed that you didn't bring it up. Another version of that is, I'm working on myself because I want to be a better leader for you, and in the past I've let you down. I've avoided having difficult conversations that would have been beneficial for you because I don't like conflict and it's not okay. But if it's okay with you, I'd like to have this tricky conversation because I feel like it would really help you. Again, it's an example of how that vulnerability can be shared. Just a reminder to everyone, if you do have questions, put them in the Q&A in case you weren't here at the beginning. because we will be answering questions at the end. You also need to think about how you're going to wrap up the conversation. When it's time to wrap it up, think about how you might do that. You know, I feel more settled about this. Oh, I feel like we're headed in a better direction. I'm glad we had the opportunity to have this conversation. That doesn't mean you might have agreed on everything. It doesn't mean everything's resolved. I'm glad we had the opportunity to have this conversation. You know, I'm now going to go away and you know, have a think about what we've discussed and look into some of the things you've raised further. And I will get back to you by the end of the week. But the other thing you need to do is say to them, how about you? How do you feel about how it's gone today? And then stop talking. They might have something to say, they might not, but you need to give them the space to have their say. And it will depend on the individual. But the fact that you've given that opportunity and asked them how they're feeling right now can have a really powerful effect on how they're left feeling at the end of that meeting. So I want to address a couple of specific things. I asked our team to share some examples, and I thought of some examples that I've dealt with on a regular basis, just to talk through some more specific examples and how you would approach them. And the first lot I'm going to talk about are about addressing expectations and boundary type issues. Now, I find these ones a little easier than others because they're usually fairly black and white. So, for example, you might have an employee who's been turning up late for work, or maybe they've been late back from breaks. That's quite a common question we get. Now, the first thing I need to say is you need to address it. We get people that ring us and say, I've got this employee, they've been late 3 times this week. And my next question is, what have you done about it? They're like, oh, nothing. I'm ringing you. Well, even, you know, maybe the first time they turn up late or come back late from their break, say, hey, listen, just a reminder, we do need you here on time because it does impact others. And they might say, oh, yeah, look, there was a lot of traffic this morning. Yep, I understand that happens, but you really need to make sure you're here on time. Now, when it becomes a pattern and we're at time 2 or 3, say it, you know, have that conversation with the employee. Look, you know, I know we had a chat earlier this week about you being late, but that's the 3rd time this week that you've turned up late. Is there anything going on? And they're like, oh, look, you know, there just seems to be more and more traffic every morning. Use it as an opportunity to reset expectations. Look, I understand that can happen, and you know, particularly, you know, for example, where we are, there's a lot of roadworks going on at the moment, and that can affect it. But you might need to adjust the time you're leaving because it is really important that you are here on time. So if you think about the CSI approach, core, situation, impact, you know, when you don't arrive on time, it can cause a lot of flow-on issues for everybody else. This morning, the phones were ringing off the hook and you were 5 minutes late, and we had patients or clients in the waiting room, and it really caused a lot of other people to be behind on their day because you were late. So, you know, we really need you to make, you know, maybe you need to get up a bit earlier or take a different way to work. Or maybe you need to, you know, we had one recently where someone was moving their car in breaks and taking too long. And they're like, well, I said, well, part of that, they need to find a solution to that. The solution is not, well, can they find a solution that doesn't involve them moving the car in their breaks? Can they park 5 minutes further down the road and it's all day parking? Or you come to an agreement on what's acceptable, but you need to address that issue. I had an employee once that we had to give a warning. It was a manufacturing production line. There was 3 shifts. So it was very important because that shift couldn't start till everyone was on the line. And he was 20 minutes late. And so we sat him down and we gave him a warning. And a couple of weeks later, he was 10 minutes late. So we called him in for another warning. And his response was, but I was only 10 minutes late this time. I've really improved. And I just said, mate, you can't be half pregnant. You're either on time or you're not. And that's why I like these issues, because they're black and white. You're either on time or you're not on time. And so by having these conversations early, or good conversation early, hopefully they'll fix it. But if they don't, you've set up a pretty strong groundwork for if you do need to move to warnings, because you can say, well, we've had this conversation 3 times. You haven't changed your behaviour. So we need to let you know that if you don't, you're putting your job at risk. And an employee not getting work completed, it's kind of similar in a way. It's black and white. They're either doing it or they're not. But you do need to explore why. because you can't just make the assumption they're lazy and they're not doing it. Particularly when you're in a situation where maybe an employee has multiple managers or multiple people delegating work to them. A really good example would be an admin person or a receptionist, and maybe you're quite annoyed because they're not doing your work, but you're not realizing that other people are coming to them and telling them that their stuff is more urgent, and they just haven't been able to put their hand up and say, hey, I need clarity on expectations. So again, it's one of those issues that you should go in for understanding first. What is the issue? What's causing it? Is it something within their control or outside of their control? How can you support them or help them? Can you give them some more coaching around time management? Can you pair them up with someone else who can help them, learn how to manage their time better, whatever that might be? So don't just make sure you go in with the expectation that there might be things you don't know, but once you've got a fair idea, then you can clarify those expectations moving forward. And when an employee has a lot of small issues, but none of them seem big enough to deal with. So one of our clients once rang me and said, and she knows that I use this as an example in training. I have an employee and it feels like they're throwing marshmallows at me. And my response to that was, I need more information. Essentially, she had an employee and there was lots of little issues and none of them seemed big enough to take the time out to address, but they were becoming really annoying, like someone throwing marshmallows at your back, none are leaving bruises, but over time, you're going to start to get really annoyed about it. So we sat down and had a discussion and I said, tell me all of the little things. And we started to write them down. And what became apparent was that all of these little things, and there was somewhere between 12 or 15, something like that, they actually fell under three main categories. One was that the employee wasn't getting work completed. A second was that she was overstepping the boundaries of her role. And the third one was she didn't seem to have a filter that she put in place and she would say inappropriate things to people. So instead of being 15 little issues, they were examples of three larger issues when you sort of looked at them all together. So we were able to sit down and address those three larger issues using those little things as the examples. So when you're dealing with these type of issues, really make sure you've got clear and specific and factual feedback. And follow up in writing. If you've had a conversation with someone on any of these kind of things, you don't have to do a formal letter or anything. It could be a Slack message. It could be an email saying, hey, thanks for the conversation today. It could even be a text. I'm glad we could have that conversation today, just so we're both clear. We've agreed, you've agreed that you're going to leave you're going to make sure that you're here on time, or you've agreed that you're going to find somewhere else to park your car so you don't have to move at every break. Let me know if you've got any questions or you want any further clarity. That date and time stamps that you've had that conversation. Hopefully you never think about it again because that employee just moves on and makes the change you need. But if they don't and it needs to move further, you've got something to use. Now, this brings us on to some behavioural, attitudinal and personal issues, which are always going to be more difficult because they're always more nuanced. And again, I'm going to be so broad with these because each of these issues can be so nuanced to the situation, the employee and the circumstances. But the number one question that I get at least once a year in 27 years of HR, almost every single year, I have at least one question about an employee with a hygiene or a body odor issue. And people ring me hoping that I will give them the magic answer of how to have this conversation without it being awkward. There is no magic bullet. It's going to be an awkward conversation. It's going to be uncomfortable for everybody. And I think the best way to approach it is to go in knowing that and acknowledging it, saying to the employee, I need to talk to you about something. It's going to be incredibly awkward for both of us. And there's nothing I can do about that, but I would rather talk to you about it directly than have people discuss it behind your back and rip the Band-Aid off. It's never going to be an easy conversation, but I can assure you that that employee is going to no matter how hard it was in the moment, is going to much prefer that you deal with that sooner rather than later than to find out that people have been talking about it behind their back and avoiding that conversation for months. That will cause so much more embarrassment for them. We recently had a client in the last 12 months who had an employee who was from a background where they cook with a lot of strong herbs and spices and things. And the smell of that cooking and those spices would permeate in her clothes. And I kind of likened it a little bit with smoking. Like, those of us that remember when smoking was everywhere, you didn't really notice it as much. But once smoking got banned from a lot of places, if you've ever had an employee that's gone out and had a cigarette in their car and walked back in the office, it is so strong and stands out so much. They probably don't smell it at all because they're so used to it and they're desensitized to it. But in this case, this employee was, they might cook up over the weekend, and she'd come in on a Monday morning, and her clothing would be very strongly smelling of those cooking smells. And it was really noticeable, not just to other employees, but also to people that she was meeting with. So it kind of needed to be addressed, but it doesn't have to be addressed in a way that embarrasses that person. It's letting them know that people have noticed it. It is quite strong and noticeable to people, and what there may be something that she could consider doing, and acknowledging that they might not have realized that was the case. So not an easy issue to deal with, but it's a rip the band-aid off. Do it with empathy. And I also think whenever you're hesitating to have a conversation because it's going to be really hard for you, put yourself in their shoes. How would you feel if you were walking around and you had you were smelling and no one knows? I've got a 16-year-old boy. I have a 9-year-old boy that showers 3 times a day, and I have a 16-year-old boy that I'll get to like day 3 or 4. I'm like, mate, a deodorant shower is not enough. Not all teenage boys, apprentices. We've had these conversations with apprentices so often. You may have to set a standard for them that, what on a weekend, if you deodorant shower, that is your prerogative. But when you come to work, you're working with other people, you're in their vicinity, we're going to people's houses, you need to shower and wear clean clothes every day. Some people need to hear it. Probably the number one on the list that came up was employees taking a lot of personal leave. The first thing I will say is that an employee who's taking personal leave that is providing you with evidence that they're entitled to that personal leave, it's not an issue you can address. So it is not the issue. You cannot make decisions about someone's employment based on the fact that they took personal leave. Even once they move into unpaid personal leave, if they're providing evidence, they're allowed to take that leave. So to me, it becomes why it's an issue. Now, I understand someone taking a lot of leave can be an issue when, with understaffing and things like that. So the way to approach it is not you're taking too much leave. The way to approach it is to say to the employee, now, there may be a couple of reasons why it's come up. It may come up because they're now having performance issues because they haven't been there very much. And so therefore you're addressing a performance issue, and what comes up, they say, well, I've been away sick. That's why there's a performance issue. If that's the case, then the conversation is along the lines of, well, I have noticed that you've taken quite a bit of time off. Is there something we need to know about? Is there some way we could support you? Do we need to adjust how you're working for a period of time so that you get a chance to, recover from whatever the issue is, or temporarily reduce your hours or maybe make some adjustment so that there's a bit more certainty for everybody else, because there is an impact when you're not here unexpectedly. And if, how would you feel about us writing to your doctor and in getting some information from them on how we can support you better, and them for making a decision that might make it so that when you are here, we get you more often and more consistently, but then we can plan around it. So that's sort of one approach that can be taken. Or it could be that this person's just having a lot of leave and it's really having a lot of impact. Again, it comes from a point of empathy and concern. I just wanted to touch base with you because you really have been taking a lot of time off, and I'm just worried about you. I'm worried about, I just want to make sure that we're not doing anything here at work to cause that. Do you feel comfortable sharing what's going on? Again, how can we support you? Do you need some time off? Do you need, what can we do? And again, it might come back to getting some medical information. And look, these situations are so nuanced, and I would really highly recommend you reach out to one of our team before having these conversations, because they can be really, really tricky, and they're so specific to the circumstances. But if someone, it's interesting because if someone is saying that they're fine when they're at work, then you've got to judge them if they're well enough to be at work, that they're there, and you judge their performance on that. But it can get a little messy because there is a requirement legally to make reasonable adjustments for an illness or injury, even if it's an outside work one. And an employee is demonstrating mental health concerns. This comes up quite a bit these days. Now, there's a difference between an employee coming to you and saying, I'm having some issues with my mental health. I've been to a doctor. Here's what they're saying. Here's some medical advice. I need time off. I need to reduce my hours, that kind of thing. I wanted to address the time when you've got an employee who is saying to you, who you are really concerned about, you're worried there's been a real change in their behavior or what's been going on, or they're dropping their performance, and you go to them and you say, listen, I'm really concerned what's going on. Like, there's a few things, is there anything going on? And they're like, no, nothing's going on. And they won't acknowledge it. They don't want to say that there's anything wrong. They're like, there's nothing wrong with me. I'm fine. Often the reason this conversation is coming about is because you can see there's a change, and if there isn't an issue going on, you really want to be addressing that issue. If they are adamant that there is no mental health concern, you can't be what we refer to as a bush doctor. I've heard that at a conference once. So they said, and a bush doctor is someone who does their own diagnosis. Any decisions you make should be based on medical advice. So if you've got someone who's saying to you, I am fit and well to be at work, you have to manage them as if they're fit and well to be at work. So if that's the case, you might have to then go, well, okay, here's what I'm noticing in terms of your behavior or in terms of your performance. Here's what I need you to improve. And it's the same way you would anyone else who was fit and healthy to be at work. Now, if they, and again, based on facts and not assumptions, you can't make assumptions. So if someone does come to you and say they have a mental health issue, asked to write to their doctor, asked to get information directly from their doctor. It sounds bad, but don't rely on what they're saying to you or their doctor, because there's some people who prefer to be at work. And so they're not going to tell you things, they're not going to pass on information. So the more that they can give you permission to talk directly to their medical support. And also, just because they make suggestions doesn't mean you have to put it in place. If they say they can only work 2 hours a day and 2 hours a day will not work in your business, you decide what's a reasonable adjustment. You might have to say, well, for now, we might need you to have the time off, but once you're able to work at least 4 hours a day, we can have you back on and we can gradually bring you back in. Again, really hard to get too specific on it because every situation is different, but they're just some of the ones I want you to sort of think about in terms of how you approach those conversations. I'm really not going to spend much time on the disciplinary process. We did a whole webinar on the disciplinary process. It's on our website, it's on our YouTube. But I just think I want you to think about the fact that even if you're ultimately not the person responsible for the disciplinary process, when you have conversations with people, they can greatly impact the outcomes. Those early conversations and the ones along the way can have an impact at the end. So, all the things we're talking about are really important for everybody. So if something has moved past being informal feedback and needs to get into the more disciplined space, you need to think about what is the actual issue that needs to be addressed. Is it behavioural? Is it performance? Have you given informal feedback already and the issue's not been resolved? Or is it an issue that's serious enough to move past that informal into the more formal? So performance is always going to start in informal and move to formal. It's misconduct, things like bullying and harassment, or maybe serious safety things that might skip through to a warning. Very similar to everything we've talked about. Do you understand, before you start the process, do you understand the issues? Do you have all the information you need to move forward? And are you clear on what outcomes or actions you want the situation to end in? And again, we've got a whole webinar that goes into that. So to prepare for disciplinary conversations, remember the purpose. Always come back to the purpose. What is your intent? What are you trying to get out of it? Be clear on what the person needs to change or action. Think about how your response, what wording you're going to use, how you're going to frame it, how you're going to phrase it. Address the behaviour, not the person. Listen as well as speak. Avoid ambiguity and take notes. You want to take more formal notes when you're in a disciplinary situation. I'm going to just go through a couple of different scenarios that come up through difficult conversations, and then we'll open it up for questioning. Most people are familiar, I think, with gaslighting, and there's DARVO is a term that is in line with gaslighting that you may see in employees that you're having conversations with. So that's where the employee denies that the behaviour happened and they don't take any accountability for what's happened. They might then turn on the attack and attack the credibility of the person who, either yourself, who's putting the information to them, or their accuser, and question whether there's really an issue at all. And then they'll try and reverse themselves to be a victim rather than the offender. You know, they'll assume the role of victim by claiming that they're falsely accused or others are making it up to hurt them. And having that preparation, being in a situation where you're very clear on the issues that need to be addressed, is really important with dealing with people like that. Now, we all deal with people who can get defensive really quickly. So a couple of little strategies that you can use when you've got someone who, you know, gets on the defensive, or you want to prevent someone getting on the defensive. Try and start from a point of something that you agree with. I agree that this is worth discussing, or I agree it's worth talking about this issue. I agree this is something that should be put on the table. You know, agreeing helps break down those barriers. It kind of is, I'm on your side. Tell them what you've learned. Now, you may not come to an agreement, but you might say, I've learned that this is a really frustrating or important topic for you. I've learned that this is something that really, really affects you. The phrase I've learned makes someone feel like you're listening to them. And that's helpful to know. They may be telling you things that are not relevant, but that's helpful to know. Again, it means that it tells them that you're taking on what you're saying. Doesn't mean that you're believing them. It doesn't mean that you're, not agreeing with them, but you're letting them know that is helpful to know. Sometimes we have someone who is quite rude in their interactions with us. Starting with "did you mean" can be really useful. Did you mean for that to be insulting? Did you mean for that to come across as rude? And that gives that person a chance to clarify or apologize, because you're not just going, oh, that was so rude, or that's so mean. You're like, hey, did you mean for that to come across like that? Now, sometimes people miscommunicate, or they communicate without thought. So it gives them a chance to clarify or apologize and say, oh, actually, no, I didn't mean that. Sorry, I didn't mean it for it to come across like that. It also works in texts and emails. Did you mean for that email to be short and abrupt? So rather than just responding like they, remember that people aren't always great at communication. So give them the opportunity to clarify. And it's a bit similar when you're dealing with someone who's passive aggressive, someone who's saying things and you're like, sounds like you might have been having a bad day, or have I actually said something that offended you? And it tells them that you're perceiving that the negativity coming from them, and allows them an opportunity to go, oh, no, that wasn't what I meant. Because again, people are not always good at communicating. Now, there may be times when you need to apologize. I knew we were going to go over time with this one. And so if you are in a situation where you've realized that you've made a mistake, you have contributed to the situation, or maybe you just didn't respond well in the moment because you're a human being, begin with, I'm sorry that I. So that is, I'm sorry that I didn't, that I said I didn't care. I'm sorry that I walked off on you in that conversation. You're genuinely taking responsibility for what you did that wasn't okay. Follow up with, next time I will. Next time I'll check with you before making that decision. Next time I'll let you know it's not the right time to have a conversation with me because I'm in a bad mood, or whatever it might be. Or even better, ask the person, how can I do better next time? What could I do differently for you next time? It's about taking responsibility. And the most important is to finish with a full stop and not a comma. Because if you say, I'm sorry that I snapped at you, but as soon as you add but, you're diluting that apology, and it's all about justification. So just, I'm sorry that I snapped at you. That's taking responsibility. It may be that you are reacting to them, but you still chose to do it. It was your response. You own it. And again, it sets a really good example for others on how to do that as well. And if you're going to expect your employees to take responsibility for their actions, you need to take responsibility for yours. There's a couple of phrases I'd like people to stop saying. I hate to bother you, but yeah, no, you're actually setting an expectation that having a conversation with them is going to be a bother to them. When you get a few moments, I'd love to grab some time with you. You're not bothering them. You're actually, you have a reason that you need to have a conversation with them. Does that make sense? I know that I do this, and I do it to my team. I'm sure that my team that are watching this are going to find that funny. Instead of saying, does that make sense? Say, do you have any questions? Because does that make sense can undermine your authority in terms of what you're saying, because it can come across that you're unsure if what you're saying is correct. But also it could be taken by the person as you think that they're not smart enough to understand what you're saying. So do you have any questions is a much better response. And I don't like to, being very, don't is not like, it's a very negative word. I prefer that you didn't. I prefer that you didn't speak to me like that in front of other people. It has a different connotation by just changing a couple of words. Just to finish up, one of the things that comes up sometimes when I'm doing leadership training, in particular when we're talking about difficult conversations, is when the employee, you're having a difficult conversation with someone who's done something wrong, but the employee maybe that made the complaint is like, well, I want to know everything that happened. Tell me what the response is. Tell me what's happening. And I think that we need to remember, I like this Simon Sinek quote, that transparency doesn't mean sharing every detail. It means providing context for decisions we make. Sometimes someone wants to know everything that's happened and you need to reassure them, we have taken actions on this situation. We appreciate that you brought it to our attention, but in the same way we wouldn't share all the details about an issue we were discussing with you for your privacy, we won't do that for this other employee. You need to trust that we are taking the actions we've told you we would take. So transparency doesn't mean you have to tell them everything. And it's, you sometimes need to ask them to trust you, and that's a choice they need to make. And remember that the behaviour we walk past is the behaviour we accept. Avoiding awkward conversations because you're a bit worried about them, or you give you anxiety, or you're worried about how that person's going to respond. So therefore you don't have them. Your silence is condoning that. So it's better to have a small, quick conversation that fixes it than let it get bigger. So a couple of takeaways I'd like you to have from today. Get yourself in the right mindset before you have these conversations. Go in with a little bit of a plan. Doesn't have to be a script. Here's what I want to address. Here's the outcomes I'm trying to achieve. Be open to listening and learning. Don't rush. Consider your responses. If you need time to think about it, say to someone, even a disciplinary meeting might, if you don't have all the information, the first one might be exploratory. It might be, I'm just going in to understand first to decide whether there's enough to move forward. And back yourself. You're a human being. You don't have to say it perfect. It's progression and not perfection. There are no perfect words to say if someone is going to feel uncomfortable, but it's actually how genuine you are when you have that conversation that really matters. So that is it for me for today. Hopefully I've still got some of you around. Trying to get my bar up. Whoop. Hang on. Oh, lost it all. I don't know what I've done now. I can't see my Q&A. Sorry, I'll go back up. We have a leadership training coming up in Melbourne in October, if you're interested. We have our next webinar will be the 101 of HR for building and trade. We've been doing, it'll be our second one this year, where we focus on a particular industry. And we do have a 2-day workplace mental health workshop coming up in Melbourne as well. There's plenty of online mental health as well, so you can always check out the links on our website. We are launching our Food for Thought series. I was hoping in September, but wasn't anticipating needing surgery. Food for Thought will be our lunch and learn type series. And we're going to have a number of different topics that you can look at. You can sign up for the Punnet, which is our newsletter on our website, on the front page of our website, and we're on all the socials, and we often share a lot of things. And yeah, if we have any questions, if I can work out how to get them back up. Nope, that's not what I wanted to do. Just bear with me while I try and work out how to get all my okay, now it's back up. All right, so Q&A. No questions. Does anyone have any questions that they would like me to answer for them while they've got me? I'm happy for you to unmute if you want to put your hand up and you want to ask the question, or you want to pop it in the Q&A box. Is there any in the chat? Let me just check. No questions. Okay, well, if no one wants to, oh, no, got a couple of questions now. Excellent. Oh, thanks, Jazz. Thank you, Ruby, as well. Look, a lot of these issues are very specific. So if you do have any questions, reach out. If you're currently a Strawberry Seed client, reach out to your HR support or your advisor you've dealt with in the past. Reach out and book a consultation with one of our team. We can give more specific information and advice based on specific situations. So if you do have any of those questions, get in touch. Other than that, enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.